Smoke first, then the smell of it, thick and black, rolling low across the yard. Then the horses screaming. A barn does not burn quiet. It roars, it cracks, it eats a roof beam the way a starving man eats bread, fast, greedy, without shame. A lone figure ran through that smoke, with a lantern already broken in his hand, calling a name into the flames, and the flames did not answer. Somewhere behind him a woman's voice screamed for someone to get the horses, and a shape too big to be anyone else in the county threw its shoulder against a stall door that would not give. Sparks fell like a red snow. A rafter came down. Someone was screaming his name now, not a horse's name, his. And the last thing the lone figure saw before the world went to cinder and white light was the door frame folding in on itself like a hand closing into a fist. Then nothing. Then dark. Then a silence so complete it had a sound of its own. 3 years later, the ranch sat quiet under a sky the color of a rifle barrel, and nobody in the county called it haunted anymore, though for a long while they had. Coldwater Ranch, 40 miles west of a town that did not matter yet to this story, lay flat and brown in the last of the summer heat, its fences mended in some places and sagging in others, its barn rebuilt smaller than the one that had burned. A man moved along the porch rail, with one hand trailing the wood the whole way, counting boards without seeming to count them, the way a man counts things when counting is the only map he has left. He did not need the cane most days. He needed the rail. He needed the fence posts, the water trough, the worn groove in the porch step that his own boot heel had carved over 3 years of walking the same 14 paces from door to gate. His eyes did not track anything. They stared at a middle distance that never came closer and never retreated. And that was the first thing anyone noticed about Everett Caldwell, before they noticed the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw like a dry riverbed. Blind since the fire. Blind since the beam came down. Blind since the world had gone from full color to a permanent, echoing dusk that never once let up. He did his chores by feel and memory. He knew 40 head of cattle by the sound of their breathing and the particular stubbornness of their hooves on hard ground. He knew his own hands better than he knew most men's faces now, because faces were gone to him. Gone the way his brother was gone. Gone the way easy sleep was gone. The county had decided, in the slow, unspoken way counties decide things, that Everett Caldwell was a man to be pitied at a respectful distance. They brought him nothing. They took nothing from him either, which was its own kind of insult. The insult of being left alone entirely, as though blindness were catching. Women did not look twice at a rancher who could not look back. Men did not offer partnership to a man who could not read a brand or a bill of sale without help. He ran the ranch anyway, alone, because alone was the only shape he trusted his life to hold now. That was the thing nobody understood about a man like Everett. He had not stopped wanting things because he no longer had eyes. He had stopped wanting things because wanting had cost him a brother and a roof and half his sight in one single night. And a man who has paid that price once does not go looking to pay it twice. It was old Mercer who ran the feed store and had known Everett's father before either of the sons had a whisker between them, who planted the first seed of what would not, could not, stay a small thing. "You seen the paper today, Everett?" Mercer said, though of course Everett had not seen a paper in 3 years, and Mercer knew it. And it was habit more than cruelty that made him ask. The habit of a man used to talking to men who could see. No, Silas. Read it to me if there's something in it worth the breath." Mercer had laughed, a short bark of a laugh, and then read out, slow and amused, an advertisement tucked between notices for plow blades and a lost dog. A woman, it said, of considerable size and considerable capability, sought honest work and honest lodging in exchange for labor, was willing to travel, was not, the ad specified with a kind of blunt pride that made Mercer chuckle again, afraid of hard country or hard talk. Considerable size, Mercer repeated, savoring it. You know what that means round these parts, Everett. Means she's built like a barn door and twice as strong. There's been talk of her over in the territory papers for a year now. Freak, some call her. Giant, others. I hear she's near 7 foot in her boots. Everett had said nothing for a long moment, his hand resting flat on the porch rail, feeling the grain of the wood as though it might answer a question the newspaper could not. 7 foot, he said finally. That true, you figure? Or is that a newspaper man's exaggeration, same as everything else in that rag? Don't rightly know. But I do know you need a hand round this place worse than any man I've met, and you're too proud to hire a normal one who'd pity you inside a week and quit inside a month. That had landed harder than Mercer likely intended, and Everett had gone quiet the rest of the visit, turning the words over like a stone in his pocket, worn smooth by handling. And he did not yet know that a woman 400 miles east was, at that very hour, folding the last of her belongings into a trunk because a man in a fine coat had just told her, with great courtesy and greater cruelty, that her services were no longer required. Her name was Josephine Hart, though most of the territory east of the mountains knew her only as the Giant of Millbrook Fair, a name she had not chosen, and had long since stopped fighting, the way a person stops fighting weather. She stood 6'9" in stocking feet, built with a breadth of shoulder and a depth of hand that made grown men take a half step back without meaning to. And she had spent 11 years of her life inside a traveling show, billed alongside a bearded lady and a man who swallowed swords, standing on a raised platform while strangers paid a dime to gawk and murmur, and sometimes, when they thought she could not hear, to laugh. She had built the tent poles herself most nights. She had hauled water for the horses when the roustabouts were too drunk or too lazy. She had learned, slowly and without anyone teaching her, that her size was not a curiosity so much as a tool, and that a tool used well earned its keep, even in a world that only wanted to look at it and never wanted to know it. The show's owner, a smooth, soft-spoken man named Wendell Price, who wore a gray coat that never seemed to gather trail dust no matter how far they traveled, had built his fortune on faces and bodies the world called strange, and had built it, Josephine came to understand only slowly and only painfully, without ever once paying a fair wage to the people whose strangeness filled his purse. When the show's finances soured, when a rival outfit undercut his ticket prices 2 towns running, Price did what smooth men do. He found the cheapest way out. He called Josephine into his tent one gray morning, offered her coffee she did not drink, and told her, in a voice as calm as a man discussing the weather, that the show could no longer afford her keep, that a smaller, less remarkable troupe would do just as well for a fraction of the cost, and that she was, regrettably, released from her contract, effective immediately. 11 years, Josephine said, and her voice did not shake, because she had long ago trained it not to. 11 years I built your tents and hauled your water, and stood on that platform so folks could stare at me like I was a 2-headed calf, Mr. Price, and this is the whole of what you have to say to me. "I have always dealt fairly with you, Miss Hart," Bryce said, and he smiled the smile of a man who believed his own lies completely, which was, Josephine thought, the most dangerous kind of liar there was. She did not argue further. Arguing with a smooth man was like arguing with a closed door. She packed her trunk that same afternoon, took the wages owed her, which amounted to considerably less than she was due, and considerably more than Price wanted to part with, and walked out of the show's winter camp with nowhere in particular to go, and a whole life's worth of practice at being looked at and never seen. It was in a rooming house 3 towns later, restless and low on funds, that she saw the advertisement in a stack of week-old newspapers left by the stove. A blind rancher out west seeking a hired hand, honest work, honest wage. No mention of size or shape or spectacle at all. And something in the plainness of those few printed lines caught at her the way nothing had caught at her in a long while. She wrote a letter that night by lamplight, and tore it up twice before she let herself send the third try. Because it was the first time in 11 years she had asked anyone for anything without a platform and a dime between her and the asking. She did not sleep much that night, turning the folded advertisement over on the rooming house nightstand the way a person turns over a coin they are not yet sure is real currency. 11 years of platforms and painted signs had taught her to expect a catch in anything offered too plainly, some hidden clause, some cruelty tucked behind the courtesy. And she read the little printed notice a dozen more times, searching for it, and did not find one, which unsettled her almost more than finding one would have. She thought of Price's smooth voice telling her she was regrettably released. And she thought, too, of the particular ache of standing on a platform while children pointed and their mothers hushed them too late. And she wondered what kind of man wrote an advertisement asking only for honest work from honest hands, no mention made of what those hands were attached to. She had learned, over 11 years, to armor herself before any stranger's gaze ever reached her, to enter a room already braced, shoulders squared, chin level, expecting the flinch before it came, so that it could never catch her unguarded. It was exhausting work, that bracing, a labor no one else could see and no one ever thanked her for. And some nights, alone in whatever rented room the show's schedule had left her in, she had wondered how much of her life had been spent simply getting ahead of the world's judgment, rather than living inside whatever time judgment left over. The letter she finally sent was shorter than she wanted it to be, and longer than she meant it to be. And she read it back once more before sealing it, satisfied that it held no apology in it anywhere, only fact, plainly stated, the way she had decided long ago a person ought to state the truth of themselves, if they meant to state it at all. She did not know, sealing that envelope in a rented room 400 miles east, what manner of man waited on the other end of it, whether he was kind in truth or merely polite on paper, whether Coldwater Ranch would prove another platform dressed up as a home. She only knew that for the first time in longer than she could easily measure, she had asked for something plainly, instead of being offered a dime's worth of pity, and that the asking itself, whatever answer came back, had already changed something quiet and stubborn in her chest. The letter reached Coldwater Ranch on a Tuesday, carried out from town by Mercer himself, who read it aloud on the porch, because Everett could not read it any other way. And Mercer's voice slowed as he went, the amusement of a week before draining out of him line by line. "She writes," Mercer said, "that she's strong enough to do the work of 2 men, honest enough to tell you plain what she can and cannot do, and that she does not require special treatment nor special conversation, only a fair wage and a roof that does not leak." He paused. "That's it. That's the whole letter, Everett. No flourishes, no excuses. She even wrote her height at the bottom, plain as you please, 6'9", like she expected you to hold it against her before you ever met her. Everett sat with that a long moment, his blind eyes fixed on the middle distance, his thumb tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "Read me the last line again." Mercer found it. She writes, "I have spent my whole life being looked at. I am hoping, sir, you might only need someone to work." Everett said nothing for a long while after that, which was, Mercer had learned over 3 years of visits, its own kind of answer. "Write her back," Everett said finally. "Tell her the wage is fair and the roof does not leak, not since I fixed it myself last spring. And tell her—" He stopped, searching for the words the way a blind man searches a dark room for a familiar chair. "Tell her a man who cannot see has got no use for judging what a person looks like. Tell her that's the one thing this place can promise her for certain." Mercer wrote it down exactly as Everett said it, and did not add a single word of his own, though he wanted to, though he thought privately that this correspondence between a blind rancher and a giant woman 400 miles distant was the strangest and most hopeful thing he had witnessed in the county in a decade. He posted the letter himself the next morning, and he did not yet know that the woman reading it 3 weeks later, in a rooming house that smelled of coal smoke and boiled cabbage, would read that one line about judging nothing she looked like so many times the paper began to soften at the fold. Word travels strange in ranch country, faster than a man riding hard, slower than a man wishes when the news is his own. By the time Josephine's return letter came, confirming she would take the position and naming a date she would arrive by rail and then by whatever wagon could be found to carry her the last 40 miles, half the county already knew a giant woman was coming to keep house and work cattle for the blind Caldwell boy. And the county, true to its nature, had opinions about it long before it had facts. "A blind man and a giantess," said Hollis Reed, who ran the mercantile and considered himself a wit. "Now there's a matched pair the good Lord never intended." He said it to a half-dozen men loitering by his counter, and they laughed the easy, careless laugh of men who have never once considered what it costs to be the joke, rather than the one telling it. Not everyone laughed. Widow Calloway, who lived 2 farms over from Cold Water and had brought Everett a pie every month since the fire, without ever once being asked or thanked properly, said only, "Man could do worse than a strong back and an honest tongue," and went back to her churning. And that was the end of her opinion on the matter, offered once and not defended, which was, in its way, more powerful than any argument. The town, as towns do, began to brace itself for a spectacle. Word was she stood near 7 feet. Word was she'd been in a traveling show, a genuine curiosity, paid to be gawked at. And there is a particular ugly hunger in small towns for the chance to gawk for free at something they once had to pay a dime to see elsewhere. Everett heard none of this directly, since no one troubles to gossip cruelly within earshot of the man the gossip concerns, but he felt the shape of it in the too careful way Mercer changed the subject on his visits, and in the particular silence that fell over the general store the one time Everett had cause to visit it that month, led by the hand of a stable boy he paid in coin and cornbread. He did not know precisely what was being said. He knew enough. A man who has lost his sight develops other senses for cruelty. He can hear it in the pause before a sentence, same as he can hear rain coming in the particular hush that falls over grass before the first drop lands. He said nothing about it to anyone. He simply went on mending fence and counting boards and waiting, without admitting to himself that he was waiting, for a wagon that would arrive from the east carrying a woman he had never seen and never would. The wagon came on a Thursday in late September, when the light goes long and gold and generous across a prairie. though of course Everett could not have told you the color of it, only the particular warmth of a late afternoon sun on the back of his neck as he stood at the gate, having walked out there alone against Mercer's advice that he wait on the porch, where the ground was more familiar underfoot. Half the county, it seemed, had found some excuse to be traveling that same stretch of road that same afternoon, and they clustered at a respectful, curious distance, close enough to see, far enough to pretend they had only happened by. The wagon creaked to a stop. The driver, a hired man from town who had collected Josephine and her trunk from the rail depot, climbed down first and went round to help her, though as it turned out, she required no help at all. She stepped down from that wagon the way a person steps down from a place they have decided finally not to apologize for occupying, and the crowd's collective breath caught audibly, a soft, communal gasp, because she was every bit as tall as the rumor, and taller, somehow, for being real instead of a story told secondhand. 6'9" of solid, capable woman, in a plain traveling dress and boots built for work rather than show, her dark hair pinned back simply, her jaw set in the particular way of someone who has learned to enter a room or a crowd or a county, already braced for the worst it might offer. The crowd stared. Of course they stared. That was the one thing Josephine Hart had never in her life been spared, and she stood there and let them look their fill. Chin level, shoulders square, the old performer's trick of turning a gawking crowd's power back on itself, simply by refusing to shrink. And then her eyes found Everett, standing at the gate with his blind gaze fixed on nothing, and his hand resting on the topmost rail. And something in her face changed, some old guarded thing easing by a single degree, because here, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, was a person looking directly at her who could not, in fact, see her at all, and so could not be doing what every other person in that crowd was doing. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, and her voice was low and even, carrying easily across the yard without needing to be raised. "I'm Josephine Hart. I believe you're expecting me." Everett turned toward the sound of her voice, and something in the county's held breath released all at once, disappointed, though none of them could have said exactly what they had been braced for. Maybe a flinch from him, maybe a stumble from her, maybe simple cruelty, freely offered and freely witnessed. Instead, Everett only nodded and extended a hand toward the sound of her and said, "I am. Welcome to Coldwater, Miss Hart. I hope the ride wasn't too hard on you." "Wagon roads are never kind to anyone my size, Mr. Caldwell, but I've had worse." She took his offered hand, and her grip was firm and careful at once, calibrated the way a person calibrates strength around something they respect rather than something they fear breaking. And Everett felt the calluses on her palm, thick ridges of honest work, and understood in that single handshake more about her than the whole county's whispered rumors had told him in 3 weeks. The crowd, denied its spectacle, began to drift back toward their wagons and their errands, muttering, unsatisfied, and neither Everett nor Josephine watched them go, because neither one of them, for perhaps the first time in years, was thinking about who might be watching. Josephine did not yet know that the barn she would help rebuild come spring stood on the exact ground where the old one had burned, nor that the fire which stole Everett's sight had never been fully explained to the county's satisfaction, only accepted as accident, because no one troubled to ask harder questions of a grieving blind man. That answer, unasked and unanswered, waited patiently in the county's collective memory, the way a buried thing waits for rain to wash the topsoil away. The first weeks at Coldwater Ranch moved the way water moves over new ground, finding the low places first, filling them slow, spreading wide before it ever ran deep. Josephine rose before dawn out of old habit, A decade of tent camp mornings bred into her bones, and she had the stove going and coffee started before Everett's own habitual waking, which unsettled him the first morning and then, by the third, became simply the shape of things. She split wood in the time it took most men to sharpen the axe, hauled water 2 buckets at a time where Everett had always needed 4 trips, and mended a stretch of fence in an afternoon that had sat broken and troublesome for the better part of a month, because Everett, working alone and blind, could not manage the heavy post-hole work by feel and memory, the way he could manage smaller, gentler chores. She did all this without comment, without preamble. The way a person does work they have decided is simply theirs to do. And Everett, listening to the rhythm of it from the porch, mending tack he could mend by touch alone, found himself measuring the days now not by the ache of his own loneliness, but by the small, specific sounds of another person's labor moving through his house and his land. They spoke little at first, and what they spoke was practical. Where the good pasture grass grew thickest, which cow was prone to wandering and which fence post she favored for scratching her hide raw. How Everett liked his coffee, which was simply black and strong, no apologies needed for a thing so plain. The first crack in all that careful practicality came on an evening in early October, when Josephine set his supper plate down a shade harder than she meant to, tired from a long day of hauling stone for a new well casing. And Everett, hearing the plate's small complaint against the table, said without any particular inflection, "You could just tell the plate you're tired, Miss Hart. Might save your wrist the trouble." There was a beat of silence, the kind that could have gone either direction, offense or ease. And then Josephine laughed, a short, surprised bark of a laugh she had not expected to give, and said, "The plate and I have an understanding, Mr. Caldwell. It knows better than to complain." It was, Everett would think later, the first joke either of them had risked with the other, small and dry and entirely without malice, and it landed the way a good joke lands between two careful people, easing something in the room that neither of them had named aloud. From that evening on, small things began to loosen between them. She began calling him Everett at his own quiet insistence, somewhere around the second week, and he began calling her Josephine not long after, though he confessed once, with the particular shy humor of a man unused to confessing anything, that, in his head, he still sometimes thought of her as the considerable Miss Hart, which was how Mercer had first described her, and when he told her that, expecting perhaps offense, she only laughed again, longer this time, and said that was a fair sight kinder than most things she'd been called. The symbolic weight of small objects began to accumulate between them, the way it does between two people learning each other's shape. A chipped blue mug that became, without either of them declaring it so, hers, and only hers. A particular knot Everett tied in the gatepost rope that Josephine learned to check each evening because it told her, by its tightness or its looseness, whether he'd had a hard day of it moving about alone in the dark that never lifted. A hand-carved wooden comb Everett had made, slow and careful, feeling every tooth with his fingers to be sure it was smooth enough not to snag, which he left on the kitchen table one morning without a word of explanation, and which Josephine found and turned over in her big, careful hands for a long moment before she understood what it was and what it meant. A small, unconscious mirroring of two people learning each other. One gift offered without ceremony and received without more thanks than the situation could bear. There were harder moments, too. The kind that come when two guarded people begin, against their own better judgment, to want something. Josephine woke one night to the sound of Everett moving through the house in the dark, which, of course, for him was no different than moving through it in daylight, and found him standing at the kitchen window, his blind eyes fixed on the middle distance same as always. And when she asked, gently, what troubled him, He was quiet a long moment before he answered. "I used to be able to see the fire from here," he said. "Before. The old barn stood just there, past the well, and some nights when I couldn't sleep, I'd stand right at this window and watch the lantern light in the loft where my brother worked late. I still stand here some nights. Habit, I suppose. Fool thing to do, standing at a window with nothing to see." Josephine did not offer comfort in words, not right away. She only came and stood beside him at that window, close enough that her shoulder nearly brushed his, and said nothing for a long while, which was its own kind of answer. And eventually Everett said, quiet, almost surprised at himself, "I lost my brother in that fire, Josephine. Caleb. 2 years younger than me and twice as reckless. And I have never once told anyone outside this county the whole shape of what happened that night, because the whole shape of it does not entirely make sense to me even now." Josephine did not press him. She only said, "You don't owe me the whole shape of anything, Everett. Not tonight. Not till you're ready to hand it over whole." And that, more than any comfort she might have offered, was what allowed him to say, some weeks later, a little more of what he remembered, though not yet all of it. Not yet the detail that would matter most when the trouble finally came looking for them both. He did not yet know that Josephine, working the far pasture fence one gray morning not long after, would find, half buried in ground that had never been plowed since the fire, a scrap of oiled tarp and a rusted length of chain that had no earthly business being out there at all, and that she would say nothing about it yet, turning it over in her mind the way she turned over the wooden comb, waiting for the right moment to ask the question it raised. Winter closed in slow that year, the way it does on the high plains, arriving first as a color change in the grass, and then as a bite in the morning air, and then, all at once, as a hard white weight over everything. Coldwater Ranch settled into its winter rhythm, and Josephine and Everett settled into each other's company the way two people do who have decided, without quite saying so, that the arrangement suits them better than either expected. She had rebuilt half the fence line by first snow. She had, working alongside him rather than instead of him, taught herself Everett's particular blind man's methods, the counting of steps, the memorized placement of every tool in the barn, and had found, to her own quiet satisfaction, that she was good at helping a person hold on to their independence, rather than simply taking the work from their hands. A skill she had not known she possessed until she needed it. Everett, for his part, had begun to laugh more, the sound of it rusty at first, like a gate hinge long unused, and then easier, more frequent, until Josephine realized one evening over supper that she could not now remember the last time a full week had passed without him laughing at something she said, and she found she liked being the reason for that sound more than she had liked almost anything in a long while. There were quiet evenings by the stove where he asked her, haltingly at first and then with more confidence, to describe things to him, not out of pity, he was careful to clarify, but out of simple curiosity, since his own memory of color and shape had begun, cruelly, to fade the way all memory fades without reinforcement. She described the particular blue-white of frost on a fence rail at dawn. She described her own hands when he asked, bemused, what her hands looked like, since he had only ever felt them. She described the way the winter light came low and orange through the kitchen window in late afternoon. And Everett sat very still while she talked, as though he were memorizing the words themselves in place of the pictures he could no longer hold. It was on one of those quiet evenings that Josephine finally asked him about the fire, gently, having waited what felt to her a respectful season for him to offer it himself, and having decided that some things left too long unasked calcify into wounds that never properly heal. "Everett," she said, "the barn that burned, was there ever a reason found for it? A cause?" Everett was quiet a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table, the way he did when a subject required careful footing. Lightning, the county decided. Dry summer, dry hay, a bad storm that rolled through that night. That was the official word, and no one troubled to look much harder than that, on account of I was the only one left who might have argued otherwise, and I was blind and half out of my mind with grief by the time anyone asked me a single question about it. "But you don't believe it was lightning?" Josephine said, not a question. Everett's jaw tightened. "There wasn't a storm that night, Josephine. I know that much for certain, blind or not. I remember walking out to the barn under a clear sky, more stars than I'd seen in a month, no wind to speak of. And there was a smell in that barn before the fire ever caught, a smell of coal oil, thick as paint. And Caleb had gone quiet in the loft just before the flames started, quieter than a man goes when he's simply working. And I have turned that memory over 10,000 times in 3 years, and it has never once settled into an accident in my mind, no matter how hard the county wished it to." He stopped, breathing carefully, the old grief surfacing raw despite 3 years of scar tissue grown over it. But a blind, grieving man's suspicions don't carry much weight against a county coroner's convenient ruling, and I had no proof, and no eyes to go looking for any, and so it stands in the record as lightning, and I have had to live inside that lie for 3 years because I lack the means to prove it otherwise. Josephine sat with that a long moment, and then, carefully, deliberately, she told him what she had found in the far pasture weeks before, and said nothing of until now. The scrap of oiled tarp, the rusted chain, buried in ground that told her, by the particular flattened, disturbed quality of the soil beneath it, that it had not simply fallen there by accident or weather, but had been placed and covered and left. Everett went very still. "Show me," he said. "Tomorrow, in daylight, though I know daylight means little to you and me both out there. Show me exactly where." She agreed, and she did not yet know, nor did he, that the buried chain and tarp were only the smallest visible edge of something far larger and far more deliberately built, something that connected the fire that took Everett's sight and his brother to a scheme now quietly circling both of their futures, a scheme with a smooth, courteous face and a gray coat that never gathered trail dust, though neither of them had yet met the man who wore it, nor understood how closely his ambitions had already begun to orbit their small, hard-won peace. The man's name, when it finally entered their lives directly, was Julian Ashford, and he arrived at Coldwater Ranch on a bright, hard blue winter morning, driving a fine trap pulled by 2 matched bays, dressed in a wool coat too fine for ranch country, and boots too clean for honest work. And he smiled the whole while he introduced himself, a smile that never once reached the particular stillness of his eyes. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, climbing down without being invited to, "I represent the Territorial Land and Development Company, and I've come to discuss a matter of some mutual benefit, if you'd be so kind as to hear me out." Everett, standing at the porch rail with Josephine a careful half-step behind him, tilted his head toward the voice the way he did when sizing up a stranger by sound alone. "Mutual benefit for who, exactly, Mr. Ashford? State your business plain, since I've got chores waiting and little patience left over for company men in fine coats." Ashford laughed, easy and practiced, the laugh of a man who had disarmed 100 wary ranchers with that exact sound before. "Fair enough, sir, fair enough. My company is acquiring land along this stretch of river for a rail spur, and Coldwater sits, regrettably for you and fortunately for my employers, directly athwart the most favorable route survey. We're prepared to offer a generous price, well above the land's current worth, for a swift and amicable sale. This land's been in my family 2 generations, Mr. Ashford, and it is not for sale. generous price or otherwise, so I'll thank you to climb back into that trap and carry your offer to someone with less reason to say no." Ashford's smile did not waver, though something behind his eyes cooled by a single, careful degree. "I understand sentiment runs deep in a man's home ground, Mr. Caldwell. Truly, I do. But I'd encourage you to consider your position with clear eyes, so to speak, before you decide finally against us. Land disputes have a way of growing complicated, particularly for a man whose deed and boundary records might not withstand close legal scrutiny, given the unfortunate circumstances of the fire that claimed your barn and, I understand, your brother." The words landed soft and courteous and utterly vicious, and Josephine felt Everett go rigid beside her, and she stepped forward without quite deciding to, her considerable height and breadth suddenly a wall between Ashford and the porch steps. "I believe Mr. Caldwell has given you his answer, Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice low and even and entirely without warmth. "And I'd think a man in your line of work knows better than to threaten a blind man on his own porch in front of a witness who is neither blind nor inclined to forget a threat once she's heard it plain." Ashford's gaze traveled up the considerable length of her, and for just a moment something flickered there. Calculation rather than fear, a man recalibrating an equation rather than a man intimidated by size alone. "Miss Hart, I presume. Your reputation precedes you, though I confess the newspapers rather undersold your presence." He said it smooth and courteous, and somehow that courtesy made it worse than an insult shouted outright would have been. "I meant no threat, only an observation that legal matters can become complicated when records are incomplete, which happens, regrettably, in cases of fire and loss. I would hate to see Mr. Caldwell's position weakened by circumstances entirely beyond his control. Good day to you both. I expect we'll speak again." He climbed back into his trap, and the bays pulled him away down the frozen ranch road at an unhurried trot. And Everett stood a long time on the porch after the sound of the wheels had faded entirely, his jaw set, his blind eyes fixed on nothing. "That man knows something about the fire," he said finally. "Or he knows something about the paperwork, and he means to use whichever lever moves easiest." Josephine's hand found his shoulder, steady, grounding. "Then we find out which lever it is before he pulls it all the way through," she said, and neither of them yet knew how closely those two threats, the fire from 3 years past and the land scheme unfolding now, would prove to be a single scheme wearing two different faces, one buried in ash, and one dressed in a fine gray coat that never gathered trail dust. They rode out to the far pasture the very next morning, Josephine leading Everett's horse by a length of rope tied gentle to her own saddle horn, a compromise they had worked out weeks before that let him ride without risk while she kept both hands free. And the ground out there lay hard with frost, the disturbed patch of earth she had found weeks earlier, now marked with a stake she'd driven to remember the spot exactly. She dismounted, helped Everett down with the same easy, practiced care she brought to every task now, and knelt to dig at the frozen ground with a spade she'd brought along for the purpose. The oiled tarp came up first, stiff with cold and age, and beneath it, along with the rusted chain, a small tin box, its latch rusted through, containing papers gone soft and water-stained, but not entirely illegible. Josephine read them aloud, slow, careful, sounding out water-smeared words where she had to. They were survey documents, old ones, predating the fire by several months, bearing the letterhead of the Territorial Land and Development Company, and a signature she did not recognize, but which Everett, upon hearing the name spoken aloud, went very still at. "Thomas Renner," he said. "That was my father's old foreman, before he left the county sudden, right around the time of the fire, and nobody thought much of it since foremen come and go. But if his name's on a survey document from Ashford's own company, dated months before the barn burned. He stopped, his breath fogging in the cold air, his hands clenched at his sides. They were surveying this land before the fire. They knew the rail spur would run through here, and they needed the Caldwell land, and my father wouldn't sell, same as I won't. And then the barn burned, and my brother died, and I went blind. And the county called it lightning, and nobody looked any harder because there was no one left with eyes sharp enough to look. Josephine's hands, holding the water-stained papers, had gone white-knuckled with the effort of controlling her anger. You think they set that fire, Everett? You think Ashford's company burned your barn and killed your brother to clear a path for a rail line? I think, Everett said, low and controlled in the particular way of a man holding a great deal of fury very carefully in check, that we have found the first thread of proof I have wanted for 3 years, and I think Julian Ashford underestimated exactly how much a blind man could still see, once someone was willing to be his eyes. They rode back to the ranch house in a silence that was not empty, but full of calculation, full of a slow-burning resolve that had waited 3 years for exactly this kind of kindling. And Josephine tucked the tin box and its papers into the bottom of her trunk, beneath her folded winter clothes, and neither of them spoke of what came next that evening, though both of them lay awake a long while turning it over. And neither of them yet knew that Ashford, watching Coldwater Ranch more closely than either suspected, already had a second, crueler lever prepared, one that had nothing to do with old surveys, and everything to do with the particular vulnerability of an unmarried woman of no fixed legal standing living unchaperoned under a bachelor rancher's roof. A vulnerability the smooth man in the gray coat intended to use exactly when it would hurt the most. The second lever arrived not as a man on a horse, but as a letter, delivered by the county sheriff himself, a weathered, tired man named Garrett Boone, who had known Everett's father and did not relish the errand he'd been sent to perform. "Everett," Boone said, standing awkward on the porch with his hat in his hands, "I've got to read you something, and I want you to know before I do that I don't much care for the manner of it. But the law is the law, and I'm sworn to deliver it plain." He read out a formal notice, filed by a county magistrate at the request of, the document specified, concerned citizens, alleging that Coldwater Ranch's living arrangement, an unmarried, unchaperoned woman residing under the roof of an unmarried, incapacitated man, violated county decency ordinances, and demanding that the arrangement be corrected within 30 days by means of the woman's departure or by some other legally recognized remedy, or else the ranch's operating permits and grazing leases, which required annual county renewal, would be reviewed for revocation on grounds of moral unsuitability. Josephine, standing in the doorway listening, felt something cold settle in her stomach. The particular old, familiar cold of watching a system built by smooth men use its own paperwork as a weapon against people who had done nothing wrong except exist somewhere the smooth men found inconvenient. 30 days, she said, quiet, controlled. "And who exactly are these concerned citizens, Sheriff Boone? If you don't mind my asking plain." Boone shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "The complaint don't name names, Miss Hart. On account of the ordinance don't require it. But I'll tell you both plain since you've likely already guessed it. This notice was filed by an attorney out of the territorial capital, and the retainer for that attorney's services was paid, according to the filing fee record I happened to glance at on my way out of the courthouse, by the Territorial Land and Development Company."
Everett's laugh came out short and bitter. No humor in it at all.
So the man cannot force us off this land with his surveys alone, and so he means to force it with decency ordinances instead, use the county's own morality against us, same as he'd use a fence to pen cattle. That is a low, cowardly kind of cruelty, Boone, dressing an eviction up as concern for propriety. I don't disagree with you, Everett, Boone said, and there was real weight in it, real discomfort at being the instrument of something he clearly found distasteful. But the ordinance is real, and the filing's proper, and unless you can show the court some legal remedy inside 30 days, I'll have no choice but to act on it when the time comes, whatever I think of the manner in which it was brought. After Boone rode off, apologizing again with his hat still in his hands, the ranch house fell into a silence heavier than any snowfall that winter. Josephine sat at the kitchen table, her big hands flat against the wood, staring at nothing in particular, and Everett sat across from her, his blind eyes fixed on the same middle distance they always found. And for a long while, neither of them spoke, because the shape of what Ashford intended had become, all at once, entirely clear. Ruin Everett, through old paperwork buried in a fire 3 years cold, or ruin him through new paperwork filed this very week, and either lever, pulled hard enough, would leave Coldwater Ranch empty and available for a rail spur survey, and leave Josephine, once again, a woman with no home and no standing, cast out by a system built to serve smooth men in gray coats. There is one legal remedy, Everett said finally, very quiet, very careful, the words costing him something visible in the saying. The ordinance names it plain enough, Boone said. Some other legally recognized remedy. That means marriage, Josephine. That is the only door this ordinance leaves open to us. And I would understand entirely if you find the notion as cold and as calculated as the man who's forced it on us, because I would not have you feel cornered into a thing that ought never be decided by any man's paperwork. He stopped, and for the first time in the whole conversation, his composure cracked slightly, something raw and unguarded showing through. But I want to say, plain, since plain is the only way I know how to say anything true, that if the notion is not entirely repugnant to you, I would be glad of it, for reasons that have nothing at all to do with Ashford's ordinance, and everything to do with the fact that I have not, in 3 years, wanted anything the way I have come to want you staying under this roof. Josephine sat very still a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice had gone thick, unsteady in a way Everett had never yet heard from her. You wrote me a very honest letter once, Everett Caldwell, 3,000 miles away, and before either of us had laid eyes, or non-eyes, as it were, on the other. Said you had no use for judging what a person looked like. That was the truest kindness anyone had shown me in 11 years, and I have thought on it near every day since I stepped off that wagon. She reached across the table and took his hand, her grip careful and firm at once. I won't pretend Ashford's ordinance isn't a hateful, cowardly reason to hurry a thing along faster than either of us might have chosen on our own timing. But the wanting underneath it, Everett, that part isn't hateful at all. That part I'll gladly claim as my own, ordinance or no ordinance. They did not celebrate that evening, not with any great show of joy, because the shadow of Ashford's scheme still hung heavy over the whole arrangement. But there was a quiet, private warmth in the kitchen that had not been there before, and neither of them yet knew that the very next morning would bring a second visitor to Coldwater Ranch, one who would change the shape of the fight entirely. The second visitor arrived on foot, having walked the last mile from where his horse had thrown a shoe, and he was an old man, stooped and weathered, wearing a coat gone thin at the elbows. And when Josephine opened the door to his knock, she found herself looking down, for once in her life, at someone even more worn by hard living than she had expected the day to bring her. "I'm looking for Everett Caldwell," the old man said, his voice rough, uncertain, the voice of a man who has rehearsed an errand 100 times in his head and still isn't sure he has the courage to see it through. "Name's Thomas Renner. I used to foreman this place, long time back, before the fire." Everett, coming to the door at the sound of the name, went utterly still, the same stillness Josephine had seen in him the day they found the buried tin box. "Renner," Everett said, low and careful. "I know your name off a survey document filed some months before my father's barn burned to the ground with my brother inside it. You'd best come in and explain yourself plain, because I have spent 3 years wanting exactly this conversation, and I do not intend to let you leave before we've had the whole of it." Renner sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee Josephine set before him without being asked. And for a long moment he only stared into it, gathering whatever nerve had carried him the last mile on foot. "I've carried this 3 years, Everett, and it's eaten a hole clean through me. And I heard tell just last week that Ashford's men were back around Coldwater, stirring up trouble, filing papers. And I could not in good conscience let another season pass without telling you what I know, whatever it costs me." He told it slow, haltingly, the way a man tells a thing he is deeply ashamed of. Ashford's company had approached him more than 3 years back, offering him a considerable sum to survey the Caldwell land quiet, without the family's knowledge, in preparation for a rail spur route the company intended to push through regardless of whether the Caldwells agreed to sell. When old man Caldwell, Everett's father, refused outright and threatened to make trouble for the company at the Territorial Land Office, Ashford's people had grown, in Renner's careful words, impatient with the pace of negotiations. "I didn't set that fire, Everett. I swear it before God I did not. But I knew the men who did. Knew them by sight, if not by name. Rough men Ashford kept on retainer for jobs his fine gray coat didn't want touching him directly. And I saw one of them riding hard away from Coldwater the same night your barn went up. And I said nothing, because I was afraid, and because Ashford paid me a sum of money to stay afraid and stay quiet. And I have hated myself every single day since for taking it." His voice broke on the last words, and he set the coffee cup down with a shaking hand. "Your brother wasn't supposed to be in that barn, Everett. I heard that much secondhand, that the men Ashford hired meant only to burn an empty structure as a warning to your father, a message about the cost of refusing a fair offer. And they either didn't know Caleb was working late in the loft that night, or they knew and didn't care enough to check first. Either way, it was never a lightning strike, and it was never an accident. And I have let that lie stand 3 years because I was a coward. And I am here now because I would rather be a poor man with a clean conscience than a paid one with a black hole where my conscience used to sit." Everett sat with his hands flat on the table, breathing slow and controlled, working through 3 years of grief reshaping itself in real time into something harder, clearer, more purposeful. "Will you say this in front of a magistrate, Renner? Say it plain, under oath, same as you've said it to me now." Renner nodded, miserable but resolute. "I will. I should have 3 years back. I'm saying it now instead, which is 3 years too late for your brother, but not, I hope, too late to matter for whatever Ashford means to do to you and Miss Hart now." Josephine, standing at the stove, felt the whole shape of the coming fight settle into focus, sharp and clear as a winter horizon. The buried survey papers, the old foreman's confession, the county's decency ordinance filed by Ashford's own hired attorney, 30 days ticking down toward a forced eviction. Two threats that had seemed, at first, entirely separate. The ash-cold mystery of a fire 3 years gone, and the fresh, calculated cruelty of a land scheme unfolding now, had proven, exactly as she and Everett suspected, to be one single scheme wearing two faces. And Julian Ashford, smooth and courteous and utterly without conscience, did not yet know that his own hired man's guilt had finally outgrown his silence. They rode into town 3 days later, Josephine driving the wagon with Renner beside her and Everett seated behind, his good coat brushed clean, his blind eyes fixed forward with a steadiness that had nothing to do with sight and everything to do with resolve. The county courthouse sat at the center of town, a squat brick building that had seen every argument and every reconciliation the county had ever produced. And word had gone ahead of them, the way word always does in small places, so that by the time their wagon pulled up outside, a crowd had already begun to gather, drawn by rumor of a confrontation nobody wanted to miss. Magistrate Aldous Whitfield, a weathered, deliberate man known county-wide for patience worn thin only by genuine dishonesty, had agreed to hear the matter that afternoon, both the decency ordinance complaint and, at Everett's formal request delivered through Sheriff Boone, a new complaint of arson and conspiracy against the Territorial Land and Development Company and its agent, Julian Ashford. Ashford himself arrived not 10 minutes after the Caldwell party, stepping down from his fine trap in his fine gray coat. And if he felt any alarm at the sight of Thomas Renner sitting beside Josephine on the courthouse steps, he did not show it, his smile as smooth and untroubled as ever. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "And Miss Hart, and, why, Mr. Renner. What an unexpected pleasure. I confess I did not know you'd return to the county." "You knew well enough I hadn't left the territory entirely, Ashford," Renner said, his voice steadier now than it had been at Everett's kitchen table, 3 days of resolve having hardened rather than softened. "You paid me to stay quiet, not to stay gone." Something flickered behind Ashford's eyes, quick and cold, and then smoothed over again just as fast. "I've no notion what you mean, Thomas, but I expect the magistrate will sort out whatever confusion has taken hold of your memory. Shall we go in? I understand there's a matter of some tedious county propriety to settle first." Inside, the courtroom filled fast, the crowd from the street pressing in behind them, Mercer and Widow Calloway and Sheriff Boone and even Hollis Reed from the Mercantile, all of them come to watch, though none of them, Josephine thought, watching them settle into the benches, had come expecting quite the spectacle that was about to unfold. Magistrate Whitfield took the bench, called the room to order, and began, as procedure demanded, with the decency ordinance complaint, reading the filing aloud in a flat, unimpressed voice that suggested he found the whole matter distasteful even before either side had spoken a word. "Mr. Caldwell, Miss Hart, I understand you wish to address this complaint directly," Whitfield said. Everett rose, one hand resting lightly on the table edge for orientation, and spoke plain, the way he spoke everything. "Your Honor, Miss Hart and I intend to marry, which, I understand, satisfies the ordinance's own stated remedy, so the complaint itself is moot as filed. But I would ask the court's indulgence to address a graver matter first, since I believe the two are connected, and I believe this courtroom deserves to hear the whole of it before we settle anything so small as a decency filing." Whitfield's eyebrows rose slightly, curiosity sharpening his weathered face. "Go on, Mr. Caldwell." And so, plain and unhurried, in the particular steady voice of a man who has waited 3 years for exactly this moment, Everett told the whole shape of it. The fire, his brother, the survey documents buried in the far pasture, which Josephine now produced from a satchel and handed forward to the bench, water-stained but legible. The company letterhead, Renner's name on the old survey, And then Renner himself called forward, swearing his account before the magistrate and the packed room, his voice shaking at first, and then steadying as he spoke, laying out in full what he had confessed at the Caldwell kitchen table 3 days before. The hired men, the warning fire gone wrong, Caleb Caldwell dead in a loft nobody meant to burn with him inside it, 3 years of paid silence finally breaking apart in open court. A murmur ran through the crowd, rising, incredulous, and Ashford, still seated at the respondents' table, had gone very pale beneath his composed smile, his smoothness cracking for the first time visibly, a muscle working in his jaw. "This is preposterous," he said, standing abruptly. "The word of a disgruntled former employee against the reputation of an established company, Your Honor. This is hardly—" "Sit down, Mr. Ashford," Whitfield said, his flat voice suddenly edged with iron, "or I will have the sheriff seat you myself. You will have your chance to answer these charges, but you will do so in proper order, same as any man standing accused in my courtroom, gray coat or no gray coat." The room had gone utterly silent, the particular silence of a crowd that came expecting one kind of spectacle and found itself witnessing an entirely different, far graver one. And Josephine, standing beside Everett with her hand resting lightly at the small of his back, felt the whole weight of 3 years' injustice beginning, at long last, to shift. Whitfield called a recess of 1 hour, ordering Sheriff Boone to hold both Ashford and Renner within the courthouse, and sending a rider to fetch the Territorial Land Office's own copy of the original survey filings for comparison against the water-stained documents Josephine had produced. And the crowd spilled out onto the courthouse steps and the street beyond, buzzing with a kind of energy Everett could feel even without seeing it. A town full of people rearranging in real time everything they thought they knew about the blind rancher and the giant woman who had married her way, as they'd assumed, out of a decency complaint. Mercer found Everett on the steps, his voice rough with something Everett had not heard from him before. Real shame. "Everett, I owe you an apology, and I mean to give it plain rather than let it sit unsaid another hour. I laughed that first day, reading you that advertisement, laughed at the notion of the two of you together like it was some circus bill, rather than two people with more courage between them than most of this county's put together. I'm sorry for it. Sorrier still that it took 3 years and a courtroom full of proof to shake me into saying so." Everett, surprised by the weight of it, only nodded slowly. "You brought me the letter anyway, Silas, laughing or not, and that's more than most men in this county managed to do these 3 years past. I'll take an honest apology over a false politeness any day of the week." Widow Calloway found Josephine at the far end of the steps, and where Mercer had stumbled through his apology, hers came simpler, quieter, more direct. "I've brought Everett a pie every month since the fire, Miss Hart, and I'll tell you plain, I've been half ashamed the whole while that a pie was the whole of what I offered a man alone and blind and grieving, when what he needed was a hand and a heart, not pastry. I'm glad you came. I'm glad you stayed. And I'll thank you not to hold this county's slow, foolish tongues against the few of us who tried, in our small, poor ways, to do a little better." Josephine, unused to this particular kind of open kindness from strangers, found her throat tight for a moment before she answered. "A pie every month is more than most folks manage for anyone, Mrs. Calloway. And I expect Everett knew exactly what it meant, coming from you, even if neither of you ever said so plain." Inside, as the hour wore on, word came back from the Territorial Land Office confirming exactly what the water-stained documents had claimed. A survey filed under Ashford's company letterhead, dated 4 months before the fire, bearing Thomas Renner's signature
and a company seal that matched precisely the seal on Ashford's current filings against Coldwater Ranch. When the court reconvened, the crowd pressing back into the room thicker than before, word of the recess conversations having spread and sharpened everyone's attention. Whitfield laid the two documents side by side on his bench and studied them a long, silent moment before he looked up. "Mr. Ashford," he said, "I have here a survey document, authenticated now by the Territorial Land Office itself, filed by your company 4 months prior to the fire that killed Caleb Caldwell and blinded his brother. I have sworn testimony from your own former employee describing hired arsonists in your company's service. And I have, filed not 2 weeks past by an attorney your company retained and paid, a decency ordinance complaint clearly designed to force Miss Hart from this ranch and clear the way for the very rail spur your survey anticipated 3 years before the fire that made such clearing convenient. I confess, sir, I have sat this bench 11 years and rarely seen so complete and so damning a chain of paper laid out before me in a single afternoon." Ashford, his smoothness entirely gone now, his face gray beneath its practiced calm, attempted still to speak some final smooth sentence about misunderstandings and coincidences. But Whitfield cut him off with a single raised hand. "Save it for your own trial, Mr. Ashford, where I expect a jury of this county's citizens, several of whom sit in this very room today, will weigh your explanations considerably less charitably than I am inclined to, given what I have just heard. Sheriff Boone, take Mr. Ashford into custody pending formal charges of arson, conspiracy, and fraud, and strike this decency complaint from the record entirely, since it appears to have been filed in bad faith by a party now facing considerably graver accusations of his own." The room erupted, not into celebration exactly, but into a low, rolling murmur of astonishment, and beneath it, something like collective shame at how close the county had come to enforcing Ashford's cruel little ordinance, without ever once questioning who stood to benefit from Everett and Josephine's separation. Boone crossed the room and laid a hand on Ashford's shoulder. And Ashford, for the first time since anyone in that county had known him, said nothing at all, which was, everyone in the room seems to understand at once, its own kind of confession.
The weeks that follow Ashford's arrest moved differently than any weeks Everett could remember since before the fire. Lighter, somehow. The particular lightness of a weight finally set down after being carried so long, a man forgets what his own shoulders feel like without it. The Territorial Prosecutor's Office took up the case in earnest, building on Renner's testimony and the survey documents, and word came by letter some months later that Julian Ashford had been convicted on all counts and sentenced to a considerable term at the Territorial Prison. His fine, gray coat, Mercer reported with no small satisfaction, replaced by rougher cloth, better suited to the work he'd now be doing for a good many years to come. Renner, for his part, testified fully and faced his own reckoning with the county's justice, a lesser sentence given the weight of his cooperation and the genuine remorse the magistrate found credible in his account. And Everett, when he heard the sentence read out, found in himself, to his own quiet surprise, something closer to forgiveness than anger. "He carried it 3 years, same as I carried my grief," Everett said to Josephine one evening, turning the thought over slow, the way he turned over most things now. "I won't say what he did was right, walking away silent while a lie stood in place of my brother's murder. But I understand, better than I'd like to, what it costs a person to carry a wrong choice long past the point of undoing it easy. Forgiveness isn't the same as calling it fair, Josephine. It's just being tired, finally, of carrying the weight of hating him alongside everything else I've had to carry these 3 years. Josephine, listening, thought that a wiser and gentler philosophy than most preached from any pulpit she'd heard in her lifetime, and said so. And Everett only shrugged, uncomfortable as always with praise offered too directly, and changed the subject to the fence line that wanted mending before the ground froze harder. The county, meanwhile, had undergone its own quieter reckoning. The decency ordinance, exposed as an instrument of Ashford's scheme, was quietly repealed at the next county meeting, Whitfield himself speaking plainly to the assembled citizens about the danger of laws that could be weaponized by smooth men with deep pockets against people who had done nothing more than choose an unconventional household. Hollis Reed, who had made his joke about the matched pair the good Lord never intended, found himself the subject of some gentle but pointed ribbing from his own customers in the weeks that followed. A mild, deserved comeuppance that he bore, to his credit, without much complaint, having apparently taken the courtroom's revelations to heart more than his pride let on. Small kindnesses began arriving at Coldwater Ranch with a regularity that surprised both Everett and Josephine after 3 years of the county's careful, respectful distance. A jar of preserves left on the porch rail by a neighbor who'd never once visited before. An offer of help from 2 young ranch hands during the spring branding, offered plain and without pity, the way help is offered between equals rather than extended as charity toward the unfortunate. Widow Calloway's pies kept coming, monthly as ever, though now she stayed to share a slice herself rather than simply leaving the tin and departing. And those long afternoons on the porch, 3 of them now, instead of one lonely man eating alone, became a fixture of the ranch's slow, seasonal rhythm. Josephine, who had spent 11 years being looked at and rarely seen, found herself, for the first time in longer than she could easily measure, simply a neighbor, a rancher's wife, a woman known in the county not for her height, but for the quality of her fence work and the honesty of her tongue. And there was a particular quiet joy in that ordinariness that she had not expected marriage or geography or justice to grant her. And yet, here it was, settling over her daily life the way frost settles over grass, soft, thorough, and entirely welcome. Spring came slower than expected that year, the ground holding its winter hardness longer than usual. But when it finally broke, it broke generous, the pastures greening almost overnight, the creek running full and loud with snowmelt, and Coldwater Ranch entered its planting season with 2 full hands working it, instead of one struggling alone. And the difference showed in every fence post set true and every acre turned over in good time rather than late and half-finished. Everett had taken, over the winter, to a new habit, one Josephine noticed before he seemed to notice it himself, of standing at the kitchen window some evenings, not out of old grief-worn habit, but simply to listen to the sounds of the ranch settling into night, the particular music of cattle lowing and wind moving through new grass, and more often now, Josephine's own footsteps moving through the house behind him. A sound he had come, without quite admitting it aloud, to find more comforting than any sight he'd lost. "I used to think," he told her one such evening, the window open to let in the first warm air of the season, "that losing my sight meant losing the whole of the world, every color and shape and face I'd known, gone all at once and never coming back. I grieved that for a long while, longer than I ever let on to Mercer or the widow, or anyone else fool enough to ask after my well-being." He paused, and Josephine, standing close beside him at the window, waited, having learned by now the particular rhythm of his slower, more careful confessions. "But I've come to think there's a difference between being looked at and being seen, Josephine.
And I spent 3 years being looked at plenty, by a whole county full of folks who pitied me at a respectful distance, and never once troubled to know the actual shape of what I'd lost, or what I still had left to give. And then a woman wrote me the most honest letter I'd ever received, and told me plain she'd spent her whole life being looked at too, and asked only that I might need someone to work rather than someone to gawk at. And I have thought, more times than I could count these past months, that losing my eyes was a terrible price to pay. And yet somehow it left me better equipped than any sighted man in this county to actually see you, Josephine. Clear as anything, the very first day you stepped down off that wagon. Josephine's hand found his in the dim evening light, and she said nothing for a long moment, because some things, she had learned, land harder in silence than in any reply she could construct. And eventually she said only, "That is the finest thing anyone has ever told me, Everett Caldwell, and I intend to hold on to it a good deal longer than I've held on to anything else in my life." The wooden comb he'd carved her that first autumn sat still on the kitchen table, worn now smooth and dark with a full winter's daily use, and the chipped blue mug sat drying by the wash basin, hers and only hers still. And the gatepost knot he tied each evening had become, over the months, less a signal of hard days endured alone, and more simply a habit two people shared. A small private ritual that meant nothing to anyone else in the county, and everything to the two of them.
The full county turned out, come early summer, for what Widow Calloway insisted on calling a proper wedding celebration, since the courthouse marriage months before, hurried along by Ashford's cruel ordinance, had been a plain, practical affair, witnessed only by Magistrate Whitfield and Sheriff Boone, and the widow declared flatly that Coldwater Ranch's people deserved a real gathering, food and music and the whole county's genuine goodwill, not the grudging half-attention they'd been paying all these years. Long tables went up in the yard where the old barn had once stood, and the new, smaller one stood now, rebuilt with Josephine's own considerable help over the winter months. And the county brought food enough to feed 3 times its number, and fiddle music carried out over the pasture into the warm evening air, and Everett, standing at the center of it all with Josephine's hand steady in his own, found himself thinking that this was the first large gathering of people he had attended since the fire that did not feel, in some low, constant way, like an exercise in being pitied. Mercer made a toast, awkward and heartfelt in equal measure, raising his glass to "the finest partnership this county's seen in longer than I care to admit, and a lesson to the rest of us about looking twice, and looking honest, before we let our first foolish laugh decide what a person's worth." Widow Calloway cried, unashamed, and hugged Josephine with an enthusiasm that nearly lifted the widow entirely off her feet, an image that set half the gathered county laughing warm, easy laughter, rather than the old, cruel kind. Even Hollis Reed, present and evidently determined to make amends in his own gruff fashion, brought a gift, a set of fine iron tools for the new barn, offered without a joke attached for once in his life, and Everett accepted it graciously, understanding well enough the effort it cost a proud man to offer plain kindness after his own foolishness had been so publicly exposed. As the evening wore on and the fiddle music slowed into something gentler, Everett and Josephine stepped a little apart from the gathered crowd, out toward the new fence line at the pasture's edge, the sky above them beginning its long summer fade from gold to deep, generous blue, and Everett, feeling the particular warmth of the evening air and hearing, beneath the distant fiddle, the quiet rustle of new grass in a soft wind, said, "Tell me what the sky looks like tonight, Josephine. I know you've described 100 skies to me by now, but I find I never tire of hearing this particular one told fresh." Josephine considered it a long moment, watching the color shift, slow and generous, over the wide prairie horizon. Purple bleeding into orange, bleeding into a deep, settling blue. And she found herself, unexpectedly, near tears, though whether from the beauty of the sky itself or the particular privilege of being the one entrusted to describe it, she could not entirely say. "It's the kind of sky, Everett, that looks like it's taken its whole life to get this color exactly right, and doesn't mean to apologize to a single soul for how long it took getting here." Everett laughed, soft and warm, and drew her hand up to press against his chest, and said, "Then it's a sky after my own heart, Josephine Hart Caldwell, taking exactly as long as it needed, and owing nobody an apology for the wait." They stood there a long while, two considerable figures small against a wide, darkening landscape, neither one of them any longer the outsider the county had once braced itself to gawk at. Both of them simply and finally seen, not looked at, not pitied, not judged, but seen plainly and completely by the one person in the whole wide territory who had never once needed working eyes to manage it. Not every ending needs to be tidy to still be an ending, and this one was not entirely tidy. Ashford's trial and its unresolved edges still working slowly through the territorial courts, Renner still serving out his own lesser sentence some counties distant, the scar on Everett's face and the permanent dark behind his eyes never once undone by any of the justice that had finally, belatedly arrived. But it was, all the same, an ending of a kind, the quiet, earned kind, built brick by brick out of honest letters and careful handshakes and buried documents and courtroom reckonings and, most of all, out of two people who had each spent long years being too much for a world unwilling to make room for them, finding at last in each other a home that required no shrinking at all, and asked of them only the whole, unhidden, considerable shape of who they actually were.